world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Good. Rise before Zod. Now, kneel before Zod.
Yes, everybody, that's right. General Zod himself is the focus for today's episode of Supervillains Explored. General Zod, before his appearance in the 1978 film Superman and its following 1980 sequel, Superman 2, was a pretty obscure villain of Superman's, but the character really was given new life due to his portrayal by highly revered British actor Terence Stamp in the second Superman movie. And while Terence Stamp's incredibly famous version of the character is an interesting portrayal, today I'm actually going to be focusing more on the Zod from the comic books, neglecting his appearances in the various film and television series, including his upcoming appearance in 2013's The Man of Steel. But yeah, anyways, General Zod's first appearance was in 1961's Adventure Comics number 283. Now here, General Zod is actually just a very insane, megalomaniacal Kryptonian criminal who attempts to take over the planet Krypton with an army of robot duplicates himself, which he named Bizarro. Now, Zod's plans were pretty much set in stone after the destruction of the Kryptonian sun Wegthor by an evil Kryptonian scientist named Jaxer. And for his actions against Krypton's well-being, Zod was sentenced to the Phantom Zone for 40 years until he managed to escape and was targeted by Superboy. Yeah, he fought Superboy and he attempted to take over the planet Earth using his newfound powers that he acquired under the Yellow Sun, much like Superboy himself. But Superboy managed to defeat him and send him back into the Phantom Zone, only to escape again and again to be a regular enemy of Superman's. So, that's pretty much the Silver Age General Zod in a nutshell. Not too different from the Richard Donner / Richard Lester Superman movies version of Zod, but in my opinion the character didn't really become really interesting until the New Earth version. In the few final days before Krypton's apocalypse, General Drew Zod was the leader of the military security force protecting Krypton's Science Council. Zod, along with his Lieutenant Ursa, were sent to arrest both his mentor Non and Jor-El, who were causing a series of experiments trying to prove that Krypton was reaching its end. The Science Council believed that these experiments were causing a large amount of panic and civil unrest among Krypton's populace. However, both Zod and Ursa would actually find out that Jor-El and Non's experiments were actually very accurate, and that Krypton was, in fact, going to explode and die. So, what happened was that Zod and Ursa joined Non and attempted to warn Krypton's population of its impending destruction. However, the event that eventually turned Zod evil was when Zod's mentor, a scientific genius called Non, was apprehended by the Science Council, and not only did they apprehend him, but they lobotomized him and turned him into a mindless, dumb, kid-like savage. And this really pissed Zod off, and when this happened, since Zod and Non were such close friends, Zod pretty much swore revenge against the Council. And he offered Jor-El to help them destroy the Council once and for all, but Jor-El refused, believing that violence would only cause more problems. And this, in sense, sort of led to Zod hating Jor-El and all of his relatives in general, because not only did Jor-El refuse them, but when Zod and his followers were apprehended, they were originally considered for execution, but since Jor-El was once close friends with Zod, he proposed the idea of exiling Zod, Non, and Ursa into the Phantom Zone, which Zod in turn would hate Jor-El for. And so when Zod and his followers were put into the Phantom Zone, Zod pretty much declared war on the entire House of El, and so they resided in the Phantom Zone pretty much for the rest of Krypton's days and eventually through its inevitable destruction, which of course also caused Jor-El's son Kal-El to flee to Earth and become Superman. While Zod, Ursa, and Non were trapped inside the Phantom Zone, they eventually discovered a prison called Fort Roz, which was transported into the Phantom Zone due to some kind of projector accident, but somehow this prison was able to maintain its shape and form and wasn't actually disintegrated by the antimatter particles located inside of the Phantom Zone. So Zod, Ursa, and Non pretty much established the prison as their base of operations, and they would reside in there, contemplating how they would escape. During this time, Zod and Ursa became romantically involved, and they eventually had a son, Lord Zod. However, Zod was pretty abusive towards his son and only used him as a means to an end to try to devise a plan to escape the Phantom Zone. However, Lord Zod finally was able to escape the Phantom Zone in a small spacecraft that Zod and Ursa and Non were able to construct, due to the fact that the prison of Fort Roz was different from most other constructs in the Phantom Zone, in that inside of it, real time passed and none of the outside conditions of the Phantom Zone were able to penetrate the walls of Fort Roz. So, Lord Zod was sent out of the Phantom Zone in a spaceship that lands on Earth, where he's discovered by Superman, and he calls himself Christopher Kent. Now, Chris Kent, or Lord Zod, is actually a young boy who for a brief time was actually raised by Superman and Lois Lane. However, a beacon inside of Chris Kent's ship was able to free Zod and about 25 other Kryptonian criminals from the Phantom Zone to invade Earth. Zod eventually ambushes Superman and sends him into the Phantom Zone to pretty much take over Metropolis and turn it into a new sort of totalitarian Kryptonian city. But what happens is that Superman is freed from the Phantom Zone by Chris Kent, where Superman teams up with a slew of his mortal enemies, including Metallo, Lex Luthor, and Parasite, in order to overpower Zod and his followers and send them back into the Phantom Zone. Chris Kent does eventually betray his father Zod by sort of leading a rebellion against him. All the meanwhile, when Superman is trapped in the Phantom Zone, he manages to escape with the help of a Kryptonian scientist named Mon-El. When Superman escapes the Phantom Zone, he teams up with a few of his mortal enemies, including Lex Luthor, Parasite, Metallo, and Bizarro, to fight against Zod's army and eventually send him and the surviving Kryptonian criminals back into the Phantom Zone. And that's about all there is to the New Earth version of Zod. Now, I've only talked about one iteration of the modern day version of Zod, and believe me, there are definitely a few others worth noting. The actual first incarnation of General Zod to be shown in the modern day comics was actually from a pocket universe created by the Time Trapper. Now, this Zod was sort of a alternate universe traveling villain that was contacted by a sort of different alternate universe version of Superboy and Supergirl. They contacted the main universe Superman and caused him to battle this Zod and use a bunch of different types of kryptonite in order to kill him. And there's also the Russian General Zod, who is actually a regular human Russian baby who is apparently affected by kryptonite radiation since both of his parents were Russian cosmonauts who were extremely exposed to the spaceship that Superman was traveling in as a baby. Now, when this version of Zod was born, he became incredibly weak under yellow sunlight, but it was revealed that under red sunlight he became super powerful. So what he did is that he created a suit of red armor that would filter the yellow sunlight into red sunlight energy that pretty much made him super powerful. And so Superman would have to fight him by destroying his suit of armor, making him weak again. It's also worth noting that the Russian version of General Zod, was probably the biggest inspiration for the version of Zod that is actually seen on Smallville, because that version of Zod, much like the Russian Zod, is insanely weak under yellow sunlight, and he is trying to pretty much turn the sun red. So, my overall opinion on General Zod is this. While I respect him completely as a villain and as a character, I can't really deny that he's become sort of a pop culture legend alongside Superman, Lex Luthor, and various other characters, simply due to Terrence Stamp's portrayal of him in Superman 2. And despite the famous catchphrase, "Kneel before Zod," I have yet to actually read a comic where Zod actually says that, but it's famous, so I'll just give it that. Also, the reason why I did this video is because I just figured I would save myself a whole lot of requests, since a lot of people really wanted me to do Zod. And while he's really not one of my favorite Superman villains, I respect him immensely, and I think he's a decent villain all around. So yeah, only a couple of videos left in the Superman marathon, so I hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll see you all later.